Most wives discover their husband's infidelity through a receipt in a pocket or lipstick on a collar. Nan Talese discovered hers through a manuscript. On a spring night in 1980, she stood in a room full of New York's elite, toasting to the success of Thy Neighbor's Wife, a book where her husband, Gay Talese, didn't just confess to sleeping with other women. He turned it into a sociological experiment. The guests stared at her, waiting for the crack in the porcelain, wondering how a woman could stand next to the man who had just publicly dissected their vows. But they were underestimating Nan Talese. She wasn't just the wife, she was the editor. She had spent nights with a red pencil, methodically correcting the descriptions of the women who had taken her place in bed. She had chosen professional perfection over personal pride. She was the only woman in the world who could look at the destruction of her own happiness and think, the pacing in this chapter needs work. Nan Ahern was born in 1933 into the high altitude of American propriety. Her childhood in Rye, New York, was a landscape painted in varying shades of beige and white. This was not merely the suburbs, this was the establishment. Her father was a banker, a man of numbers and quiet authority. Her mother was a socialite, a woman for whom appearance was a moral imperative. In the Ahern household, emotions were treated like uninvited guests, glanced at politely but never offered a seat. It was a life governed by the rhythmic, hypnotic ticking of a grandfather clock. There was a time for breakfast, a time for reading, a time for prayer. It was a childhood devoid of chaos, but also devoid of oxygen. Nan was sent to the convent of the Sacred Heart, an institution designed to manufacture a very specific type of woman. The nuns, in their flowing habits, were the architects of her soul. They taught her French and literature, yes, but the real curriculum was discipline. They taught her that a lady does not raise her voice, a lady does not complain, a lady endures. The Catholicism of the 1940s was not the folk guitar religion of later decades. It was a religion of spine and steel. It instilled in Nan a profound sense of compartmentalization. She learned early on that her internal world was a fortress that no one was allowed to enter. She could be raging inside, weeping inside, dying inside, but on the outside, the face must remain a smooth, unreadable mask. This was not dishonesty. In her world, this was manners. She grew into a striking young woman possessed of a beauty that was almost severe in its symmetry. She had the Manhattanville look, pearls, cashmere, and an air of detached amusement. She did everything right. She attended Manhattanville College, the finishing school for the daughters of the Catholic elite. The script for her life was already written, leather-bound and gilt-edged. She would graduate. She would marry a man from Yale or Georgetown with a Roman numeral after his name. She would move to Greenwich, and she would raise 3 children and a golden retriever. But beneath the velvet headband, there was a glitch in the programming. Nan Ahern was bored. She looked at the boys she was supposed to marry, these soft, predictable sons of bankers, and she felt nothing. They were safe, and safety, she was beginning to realize, was a kind of death. She had a hunger that she couldn't name, a desire to be close to the fire, even if she didn't want to burn. She loved words. She loved the way a sentence could restructure reality. While her friends were planning weddings, Nan was reading illicit novels, searching for a pulse. In the mid-1950s, she moved to Manhattan. It was the checker speech era, a time of conformity, but the cracks were beginning to show. She took a job at Vogue. It was the job a girl like her was supposed to have, glamorous, clean, and ultimately superficial. She worked in the lingerie department, writing copy about silk and lace. It was a world of surfaces, and Nan was tired of surfaces. She wanted the bone and the gristle. Then in 1957, the plot twist walked through the door. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't from Yale. He was a reporter for the New York Times, but he didn't look like a newsman. He looked like a matinee idol from a foreign film. His name was Gay Talese. Gay was the son of an Italian tailor from Ocean City, New Jersey. He was ethnic, he was ambitious, and he vibrated with a nervous, kinetic energy that was the polar opposite of Nan's cool repose. He was a man who lived his life in the present tense, loud and urgent. He was obsessed with the details of other people's lives, what they wore, what they ate, what they hid. When they met, it was a collision of two galaxies. He was drawn to her silence. She was mesmerized by his noise. He saw in her the ultimate mystery, a woman he couldn't read, a story he couldn't quite crack. She saw in him the escape hatch. He was the chaotic, vibrant, messy world she had been observing through the glass of her convent education. Their courtship was a scandal in miniature. Her parents were horrified. An Italian, a reporter, a man who didn't own a tuxedo. It was a step down. It was a misalignment of the stars. But Nan, the obedient daughter, the good girl of Rye, dug her heels in. For the first time in her life, she said no to the script. They married in 1959 in Rome. It was a romantic beginning, but the reality of their return to New York was a stark lesson in the physics of their union. They were building a life on a fault line. The early 1960s in New York City was a time of aggressive transformation, and the Talese marriage became a microcosm of the era. Gay was ascending. He was rewriting the rules of journalism, pioneering a style that would come to be known as New Journalism. He didn't just report facts, he painted scenes. He turned Frank Sinatra into a tragic hero. He turned Joe DiMaggio into a mythological figure. And Nan became the typist. In the evenings after her day job, she would sit at the typewriter in their small apartment transcribing Gay's handwritten notes. She was the first filter. She was the first audience. As she typed his soaring, complex sentences, she wasn't just a secretary. She was absorbing the rhythm of great writing. She was learning the anatomy of a story. But the domestic sphere was suffocating her. She had two daughters, Pamela and Catherine. She loved them, but the role of the Upper East Side housewife fit her like a corset that was laced too tight. She found herself drifting, her intellect atrophying in the playground and the grocery store. Gay, consumed by his work, was often absent, even when he was in the room. He was a man possessed by his subjects. He would disappear for days, chasing a story, chasing a feeling. Nan remained the anchor, the fixed point, but a fixed point can easily become a forgotten point. One afternoon, in a moment of quiet desperation, she wandered into a bookstore. She wasn't looking for a book. She was looking for a sign. She picked up a volume, smelled the paper, and felt a jolt of recognition. She didn't want to write the books. She knew she wasn't the performer in the family, but she wanted to make them. She wanted to be the invisible hand that guided the talent. She applied for a job at Random House. It was 1967. The publishing world was a bastion of male privilege, a club of tweed jackets and pipe smoke. It was an industry that moved at the speed of a gentle stroll. Women were there, certainly, but they were assistants, publicists, copy editors. They were the support staff, not the decision makers. Nan walked into the interview with no experience, no portfolio, and no fear. She had spent 10 years editing the most difficult writer in America at her kitchen table. She knew she had the ear. She was hired ostensibly as a junior editor, a text editor. It was a lowly rung, but she had her foot on the ladder. Random House in the late 60s was a palace of eccentric geniuses. It was the home of Bennett Cerf, of William Faulkner, of Truman Capote. The hallways echoed with the gossip of the literati. Nan Talese, with her pearls and her silence, seemed like she would be eaten alive. But Nan possessed a weapon that the loud men in the corner offices lacked. She listened. While the male editors loved to hear themselves talk, lecturing authors on what their book should be, Nan would sit with a writer for hours, saying almost nothing, waiting for them to stumble upon their own truth. She discovered she had a gift, the golden gut, they called it. She could read a manuscript that was a messy, incoherent disaster, and see the masterpiece hiding inside the marble. She didn't impose her voice on the writer. She cleared the throat of the text so the writer could sing. Her first major success wasn't a flashy celebrity memoir. It was a dark, difficult novel. She gravitated toward the complex. She found that she had a stomach for the psychological, the twisted, the ambiguous. Perhaps it was because her own life was becoming increasingly ambiguous. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the culture began to curdle. The optimism of the Kennedy years gave way to the cynicism of Nixon and Vietnam. And in the Talese household, the ground was shifting. Gay was becoming restless. He had conquered the magazine world. Now he wanted to conquer the bedroom. The sexual revolution was exploding in New York. The pill, the feminist movement, the breakdown of traditional morality, it was all happening at once. For a writer like Gay, it was irresistible. He didn't just want to observe it, he wanted to ingest it. He began to talk about freedom. He began to talk about research. Nan listened. She sat in their beautifully decorated living room with its perfect upholstery and its carefully curated bookshelves. And she listened to her husband explain that monogamy was an outdated construct. She listened as he told her about the massage parlors he was visiting for the book. Any other woman would have screamed. Any other woman would have thrown a vase. But Nan Talese was not any other woman. She was the girl from the convent. She was the editor. She looked at her husband and she made a calculation that would define the rest of her life. She realized that she could not control him. She realized that if she tried to cage him, he would leave. And so she did something radical. She decided to stay, but she didn't stay as a victim. She stayed as a witness. She retreated further into her work, building a wall of manuscripts around her heart. While Gay was out exploring the bodies of strangers, Nan was exploring the minds of writers. She was building her own empire, brick by brick, page by page. But she didn't know that the research for this new book would consume a decade of their lives. She didn't know that she was about to become the reluctant co-star in the most scandalous nonfiction performance of the century. The 70s were coming, and they were bringing a storm that would threaten to wash away the carefully constructed facade of the Talese marriage. As she sat in her office at Random House, red pencil in hand, crossing out a superfluous adjective, Nan Talese was preparing for a war she hadn't declared. She was about to prove that in the battle between the loud and the quiet plays a longer game. But the battle lines of this undeclared war would not be drawn in the familiar, polite society of the 1960s. That decade was fading, and with it went the last vestiges of the old decorum. As the calendar turned, the atmosphere in New York City grew heavier, charged with a new feral electricity. Nan stood at the threshold of the 1970s, clutching her red pencil like a shield, unaware that the coming decade would demand more than just her editorial skill. It would demand the total surrender of her privacy. The storm she sensed on the horizon had finally arrived, and it did not knock politely. It kicked down the door. The 1970s did not arrive in New York City with a whimper. They arrived with a leer. The city was bankrupt, dirty, and dangerous, but it was also vibrating with a feral kind of energy. The prudish constraints of the 1950s had been incinerated, and from the ashes rose a culture of absolute permission. It was the era of Studio 54, of Plato's Retreat, of the sexual revolution moving from the fringes into the living rooms of the Upper East Side. For Nan Talese, the decade began with a promotion and a paradox. In 1973, she moved to Simon & Schuster, one of the great publishing houses of the era. She was no longer the apprentice. She was a senior editor. She had her own office, her own list, and a growing reputation as a writer's editor. A woman who could take a chaotic manuscript and find its skeletal structure without breaking its spirit. But while Nan was building a fortress of intellect at the office, the walls of her home were becoming porous. Gay Talese had found his next subject. After the success of his books on the New York Times and the Mafia, he turned his gaze toward the shifting sexual landscape of America. He announced that he was going to write the definitive book on desire, infidelity, and the new morality. He called it Thy Neighbor's Wife. For most journalists, this would mean conducting interviews, reading case studies, perhaps observing a few swingers' parties from the safety of a notebook. But Gay Talese was a method actor in a journalist's suit. He believed that you could not understand the water unless you drowned in it. He told Nan that to write the book, he had to live the life. The terms of the marriage were rewritten over a series of quiet, devastating dinners. Gay explained that he would be engaging in sexual relationships with other women. He framed it as research. He framed it as a necessity of his art. He assured her that he loved her, that he would never leave her, and that she was the center of his life. But the orbit was about to get very wide and very crowded. Nan's reaction to this declaration remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of her psychology. She did not weep. She did not throw his typewriter out the window. She listened with the same focused intensity she applied to a difficult paragraph. She later explained her thinking with a logic that was almost terrifying in its detachment. She viewed Gay as a separate entity, a man driven by compulsions she did not share and could not control. "I don't expect him to be like me," she would say. It was a mantra of survival. It seemed she understood that she could not stop him, so she resolved simply to outlast him. She would build a firewall between her husband and her marriage. The husband was wandering, the marriage would stay put, but the city was small and the whispers were loud. Gay began to spend time at massage parlors, the thin euphemism for brothels that dotted Midtown Manhattan. He wasn't sneaking around, he was signing his name in the guest books. He was interviewing the women, yes, but he was also a customer. He would come home to their townhouse smelling of cheap soap and other women's perfume, and he would talk about his day. Nan, sitting in her armchair with a manuscript on her lap, would listen. She treated his accounts of sexual encounters as if they were dispatches from a foreign war zone. Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately having nothing to do with her. She refused to give the situation the oxygen of jealousy. She starved the monster by ignoring it. However, the research soon escalated. Gay discovered Sandstone, a retreat in the Santa Monica Mountains of California. Sandstone was the Vatican of the free love movement, a sprawling estate where monogamy was banned, clothing was optional, and group sex was the liturgy. Gay moved there. For months at a time, he lived at Sandstone. He managed the resort. He participated in the orgies. He became a fixture of the community. Back in New York, Nan Talese became a geographic single mother. She was raising Pamela and Catherine alone. She was navigating the cutthroat politics of Simon & Schuster alone. She was attending parent-teacher conferences alone. The loneliness of this period was a physical weight. There were nights when the silence of the townhouse was deafening. She was a beautiful woman in her early 40s, surrounded by men in the publishing industry who would have happily taken Gay's place. But Nan was not interested in revenge. She was interested in dignity. She channeled every ounce of her repressed emotion into her work. The office became her sanctuary. At Simon & Schuster, there was order. There were deadlines. There were problems that could be solved with a red pencil. She began to acquire books that dealt with heavy emotional themes, stories of endurance, of trauma, of history. She wasn't just editing books, she was editing her own reality, creating worlds where the narrative made sense, even if her own life didn't. She developed a reputation for being somewhat icy. "The Ice Queen," they whispered in the break room. But the ice was necessary. It was the armor that kept the chaos at bay. Occasionally, the two worlds collided. Gay would return from California, tanned and manic, bringing the energy of the orgy into the quietude of the townhouse. He would host dinner parties, where he would regale their guests with stories of his exploits at Sandstone. He would talk about the liberation of the naked body, about the beauty of sharing partners. The guests, New York intellectuals, writers, editors, would laugh nervously, glancing at Nan. Nan would be at the head of the table serving the roast. She would smile. She would ask if anyone wanted more wine. She would steer the conversation toward politics or literature. She performed a kind of social jujitsu, using her impeccable manners to deflect the crushing humiliation hanging in the air. There is a famous story from this era that defines Nan Talese. At a cocktail party, a drunken woman, emboldened by white wine and bad manners, cornered Nan. "How can you stand it?" the woman slurred. "Knowing he's with all those women? How do you handle them?" Nan looked at the woman with eyes that were clear and devoid of warmth. "I don't handle them," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "I don't know them. They are not part of my life." It was a lie, of course. They were part of her life because they were consuming her husband. But it was a necessary lie. It was the boundary line she drew in the sand. "You can have his body," she was saying to the world, "but you cannot have my mind. You cannot have my reaction." As the 1970s wound down, the manuscript for Thy Neighbor's Wife was finally nearing completion. Gay had spent nearly a decade on it. He had mortgaged their privacy to write it. He believed it would be his masterpiece, a book that would liberate America from its puritanical shackles. Nan read the drafts. It was a surreal experience. She was editing a book that documented in graphic detail the betrayal of her vows. She saw the names of the women, she read the descriptions of the acts, and yet she edited it. She fixed the pacing, she clarified the arguments. She sharpened the prose. She separated the wife from the editor with a surgical precision that borders on the pathological. She wanted the book to be good because if the book was bad, then the suffering had been for nothing. If he was going to humiliate her, let it at least be a literary triumph. The book was published in 1980. If Nan thought the years of research were hard, the publication was an atomic bomb. The marketing campaign was aggressive. The cover featured a naked blonde woman. The media tour was relentless. The reviews were savage. Critics who had worshipped Gay for the kingdom and the power and honor. Thy father turned on him. They called the book self-indulgent, voyeuristic, creepy. They attacked him not just as a writer, but as a man. But the vitriol reserved for Nan was different. It was a mixture of pity and contempt. Time magazine, Newsweek, the New York Post, they all asked the same question: what is wrong with his wife? They painted her as a victim of the patriarchy, a woman with no self-esteem who was frightened of losing her meal ticket. They didn't know that by 1980, Nan was making a substantial salary. They didn't know she was arguably more powerful in the industry than Gay was. They didn't know that she stayed not out of fear, but out of a stubborn, intractable definition of commitment. The nadir came during a televised interview. The interviewer, leaning in with feigned sympathy, asked Nan, "Don't you feel jealous? Don't you feel hurt?" Nan sat on the soundstage under the hot lights. She was wearing a high-collared blouse. She looked like a queen in exile. Jealousy, she said, is a waste of time. It is a useless emotion. It changes nothing. It was a statement of profound stoicism, but behind the scenes the toll was visible. Friends noticed that Nan was thinner. Her smile was tighter. She developed a tremor in her hand that she hid by clutching her purse. The public humiliation was a corrosive acid. It wasn't just that Gay had had affairs, it was that he had invited the entire world into their bedroom to watch. Yet, in the midst of this firestorm, Nan made a pivotal career move. She left Simon & Schuster and moved to Houghton Mifflin, and then the ultimate coup. She was offered her own imprint at Doubleday. This was the Holy Grail. Nan Talese Books. Her name on the spine. It was a declaration of independence. She was no longer just Gay Talese's wife. She was a brand. She was an institution. While Gay was licking his wounds from the critical mauling of thy neighbor's wife, Nan was ascending to the peak of her profession. She began to assemble a list of authors that would define the next 2 decades of literature. She signed Ian McEwan. She signed Margaret Atwood. She looked for stories about women who were trapped, women who were silenced, women who found ways to survive in hostile environments. It was not a coincidence. She poured her own repressed screams into the book she published. She championed The Handmaid's Tale, a story about women reduced to their biological functions, controlled by men. She understood that book in her bones. She understood the horror of being watched, of being defined by a male narrative. By the early 1980s, the dynamic in the Talese household had shifted imperceptibly but permanently. Gay was the famous writer who had stumbled. Nan was the editor who was rising. The power balance, which had been tilted in his favor for 20 years, was beginning to level out. She had survived the 70s. She had walked through the fire, the so-called open marriage, the sexual revolution in her own living room, and the public furnace of the media, and come out not as ash, but as something close to fireproof. But the cost of survival is that you never truly leave the war zone. The secrets were out, the privacy was gone, and Nan Talese had learned a lesson that would shape the rest of her life. The only safe place is the page. People will betray you. Husbands will expose you. The public will judge you. But a sentence you can control, a sentence you can edit until it is perfect. And so, Nan turned her back on the noise of her marriage and turned her face toward the silence of the manuscript. She was done being the character in someone else's story. It was time to start curating her own. The publication of Thy Neighbor's Wife marked the death of the private Nan Talese and the birth of the public enigma. She had been dragged onto the stage of American celebrity against her will, cast in the role of the long-suffering wife. It was a role she despised, a cliché she found beneath her. But in the crucible of that humiliation, something essential in her had hardened. Over time, it became clear that her capacity for endurance would be the defining force of her life. She had stared down the sexual revolution in her own living room and refused to blink. She had learned that she could live without the safety of convention. As the 80s dawned, bringing with them a new era of excess and ambition, Nan was no longer looking for safety. She was looking for legacy. The marriage had become a scar, healed but visible. The love remained, but it was a different kind of love now. It was a love stripped of illusions, a love that had survived the autopsy. She walked into her new office at Doubleday, sat behind the heavy oak desk, and picked up a red pencil. Outside, the critics were still tearing her husband apart. Inside, in the quiet of the room, Nan Talese opened a fresh manuscript. It was blank. It was clean. It was hers. Yet retreating into the manuscript was not merely an act of hiding. It was an act of incubation. In the quiet darkness of her own discretion, Nan was forging a new self, harder, sharper, and infinitely more ambitious. As the bruising exposure of the 1970s gave way to the high-gloss ambition of the Reagan era, Nan emerged from the rubble of her husband's scandal, not as a survivor, but as a titan. She traded the role of the silent witness for the armor of the executive, stepping out of the shadows and into the corner office where she would no longer just fix stories, but own them. If the 1970s had been a decade of public undressing, the 1980s were about putting on the armor. For Nan Talese, this meant the power suit. It was the era of shoulder pads, sharp lapels, and the weaponization of elegance. She moved through the canyons of Midtown Manhattan not as a survivor of a scandal, but as a conqueror claiming new territory. The publishing industry was shifting. The old gentlemanly houses were being bought up by massive conglomerates. The three-martini lunch was being replaced by the sparkling water power meeting. And amidst this corporate turnover, Nan Talese was doing something unprecedented. She was becoming a brand. In 1990, the ultimate validation arrived. Doubleday, one of the titanic pillars of American publishing, offered her what every editor dreams of, but few achieve, her own imprint. It would be called simply Nan A. Talese Books. But an imprint? An imprint is a declaration of trust, a signal that your taste is valuable enough to build a publishing identity around. It is a declaration that your taste is so impeccable, your commercial instincts so sharp, that the corporation is willing to give you a bank account and total autonomy. It was a kingdom within a kingdom. She wasn't just Mrs. Gay Talese anymore. She was Nan Talese, president and publisher. Her office at Doubleday became a destination. It was an oasis of calm in a chaotic industry. While other editors were chasing the latest celebrity tell-all or diet fad, Nan was hunting for literature. She was looking for the voice. This period defined her legacy through two key relationships that showcased the duality of her genius: the raw emotional chaos of Pat Conroy and the cool speculative brilliance of Margaret Atwood. Pat Conroy was the test. The Southern author of The Great Santini was a man of enormous appetites and enormous wounds. He wrote like a hurricane, messy, destructive, and magnificent. When he delivered the manuscript for The Prince of Tides, it was a sprawling, unwieldy beast. It was thousands of pages of trauma, lyrical prose, and Southern Gothic melodrama. Another editor might have looked at the pile of paper and seen a nightmare. Nan looked at it and saw a masterpiece buried in the mud. The editing process of The Prince of Tides was a form of psychological warfare. Conroy was terrified of losing his words. Nan was adamant about finding the story. She didn't bully him. She didn't yell. She used her signature weapon, the whisper. She would sit with him, going line by line, gently suggesting that perhaps this 50-page digression on a sunset, while beautiful, was stopping the heart of the narrative. She acted as his therapist, his mother, and his surgeon. When the book was published in 1986, it became a cultural phenomenon. It spent nearly a year on the bestseller list. It made Conroy a millionaire. And it proved that Nan Talese could take difficult literary fiction and turn it into a commercial blockbuster. Conroy later said, "Nan Talese is the best editor in America. She saved my life." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was a man consumed by the demons of his abusive childhood, and Nan had helped him organize those demons into a narrative he could control. Then there was Margaret Atwood. If Conroy was the fire, Atwood was the ice. The Canadian author was brilliant, acerbic, and fiercely intelligent. In the mid-'80s, she brought Nan a manuscript that was a radical departure from her previous work. It was a speculative story set In a dystopian America where women were stripped of their rights, their names, and their money, reduced to walking wombs for the ruling elite. It was called The Handmaid's Tale. At the time, science fiction was considered a ghetto genre, not serious literature, but Nan saw past the genre labels. She read the manuscript and felt the chill of recognition. Remember, this was a woman who had spent her entire adult life in the male-dominated spheres of the Catholic Church, the New York social set, and the publishing industry. She knew what it was like to be valued for your function rather than your mind. She knew what it was like to be silent while men spoke. She championed The Handmaid's Tale with a ferocity that surprised her colleagues. She marketed it not as sci-fi, but as a terrifyingly plausible future. She wrapped the book in a cover of austere beauty. When it became a classic, taught in schools and debated in Congress, it was a vindication of Nan's golden gut. She had seen the future before anyone else. But while Nan was ascending to the stratosphere of her career, the atmosphere in the Talese townhouse was undergoing a strange inversion. For 20 years, Gay Talese had been the sun, and Nan had been the moon, reflecting his light. But in the 1980s and early 90s, the sun went into an eclipse. After the exhaustion of Thy Neighbor's Wife, Gay hit a wall. The words stopped coming. The man who had written with such fluid, manic energy found himself paralyzed by the blank page. He spent years researching a book about the history of Italian immigration, Unto the Sons. It was a torture chamber of a project. He would go down to his bunker, the windowless office in the basement of their townhouse, and stare at the wall. The dynamic of the marriage shifted. Nan was now the one coming home with stories of triumph. She was the one being profiled in magazines as the queen of publishing. She was the one winning awards. Gay was the one waiting at home, frustrated, wrestling with his own relevance. It was a dangerous moment for any marriage, especially one built on traditional gender roles. The great man was faltering. The little woman was flying. Yet this is where the unique architecture of their relationship saved them. Nan did not gloat. She did not use her success to punish him for the humiliations of the past. Instead, she applied her editorial instincts to her husband. She listened to his frustrations. She read his drafts. She encouraged him. She treated his writer's block with the same clinical, detached empathy she applied to her authors. She understood that the balance of power in a long marriage is never static. It is a seesaw. For 20 years, she had been on the ground looking up. Now she was in the air looking down. She knew that eventually gravity would shift again, but there was a subtle change in her demeanor at the dinner parties they continued to host. She was no longer just the silent observer. She spoke more. She interrupted occasionally. She had the confidence of a woman who knows she can pay the mortgage. One evening, at a gathering of New York's elite, a guest made a comment about how lucky Nan was to be married to such a famous writer. Nan smiled, took a sip of her wine, and said, "Yes, Gay is very talented, and I am very good at what I do." It was a quiet assertion, but it landed like a thunderclap. She was claiming her territory. By the mid-1990s, Nan A. Talese Books was a juggernaut. She was publishing Ian McEwan's Atonement, a book that would become a modern classic. She was publishing Thomas Keneally's Schindler's List, bringing the Holocaust to a mass audience in a way that changed the cultural conversation. She had perfected the art of the high-wire act. She balanced the commercial demands of the corporate owners, who wanted hits, with her own artistic conscience, which wanted beauty. She was the bridge between art and commerce. But as the millennium approached, the world was changing again. The internet was rising. The attention span of the public was shrinking. The era of the great editor was beginning to fade. replaced by the era of the marketing algorithm. And somewhere in the shadows, a young writer named James Frey was beginning to type a manuscript. He was writing a story about addiction, about hitting rock bottom, about redemption. It was raw, it was violent, and it was full of lies. He would soon send it to Nan Talese, and she, trusting her gut, trusting the emotional truth of the pages, would buy it. She didn't know it yet, but she was buying a time bomb. The triumph of her independent imprint, the decades of building a reputation for impeccable integrity, were about to be threatened by a single book. The silence she had cultivated for so long, the silence that had protected her from her husband's scandals, the silence that had allowed her to hear the voices of her authors, was about to be shattered by the loudest noise in American culture, Oprah Winfrey. Nan sat in her office looking out at the New York skyline. She was in her 60s now. She was the doyenne of the industry. She thought she had seen everything. She thought the hard part was over. She was wrong. The final act of her public drama was just beginning. By the late 90s, the Talese marriage had settled into a kind of détente. They were two separate nations sharing a border, trading goods and information, but governing themselves by different laws. Gay had finally published Unto the Sons in 1992, a critical success that restored some of his luster, but he was no longer the enfant terrible of journalism. He was an elder statesman. Nan, however, was in her prime. She had achieved a level of integration that few women of her generation managed. She had reconciled the Catholic schoolgirl with the Manhattan power broker. She had reconciled the betrayed wife with the loyal partner. But there was a cost to all this editing. When you spend your life fixing other people's stories, you sometimes lose the thread of your own. Nan had become so good at being the vessel for others, for Gay, for Conroy, for Atwood, that her own interiority remained a mystery, even to those closest to her. She was the keeper of secrets. She knew which author was drinking again. She knew which marriage was falling apart. She knew where the bodies were buried in the literary world because she had helped dig the graves. But as she picked up the manuscript of A Million Little Pieces, she let her guard down. She read it and felt the pain on the page. She connected with the suffering. For once, the cool, detached editor allowed herself to be seduced by the heat of the narrative. It was a rare moment of vulnerability. And, as is often the case in the life of Nan Talese, vulnerability would be punished. The 21st century was coming, and it didn't care about emotional truth. It only cared about the facts. And Nan was about to find herself on trial for a crime she didn't commit, in a court she didn't recognize. But the final act of a tragedy rarely announces itself with a trumpet blast. It often arrives disguised as a stroke of luck. As the new millennium dawned, Nan sat atop the literary world, secure in her fortress of high culture, believing the walls were high enough to keep out the vulgarity of the changing times. She did not hear the digital hum of the internet approaching, nor did she realize that the next manuscript to land on her desk, a messy, violent, irresistible pile of pages, was not just a bestseller in waiting, but a Trojan horse that would bring the entire fortress crashing down. The new millennium arrived in New York City not with flying cars, but with a palpable acceleration of the cultural pulse. The leisurely, tweed-jacketed pace of the 20th century publishing world was dead. It had been replaced by the high-speed data stream of the 21st. Amazon was rising. Independent bookstores were falling. The gentleman's agreement that had governed literature for decades, the unspoken understanding that quality would eventually find a market, was being dismantled by the ruthless algorithm of the bestseller list. In this brave new world, Nan Talese was an anomaly. She was a woman of the analog age reigning over a digital kingdom. Her imprint, Nan Talese Books was a boutique operation inside the corporate Leviathan of Random House. She still edited with a pencil. She still took authors to long lunches at Michael's. She still believed that a beautiful sentence was a moral victory. But even the queen of the highbrow needed a hit. The corporate overlords demanded growth, and literary fiction, for all its prestige, was a notoriously fickle revenue stream. Nan needed a book that could cross over, something that possessed the literary merit she craved, but the raw, visceral energy the market demanded. In 2003, a manuscript landed on her desk. It was typed in a frantic, breathless style. It had no quotation marks. It capitalized nouns arbitrarily, like an 18th century pamphlet. It was titled "A Million Little Pieces." The author was a young man named James Frey. He was not a polished product of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. He was a brute. He wrote about addiction, violence, and rehabilitation with a sledgehammer. He described undergoing root canal surgery without anesthesia. He described brawls with police. He described a descent into hell that was so graphic, so terrifying, that it felt less like reading and more like witnessing a car crash. Nan read it and was mesmerized. To the outside observer, it seemed like a mismatch. Why would Nan Talese, the editor of the erudite Ian McEwan, the sophisticated Margaret Atwood, the elegant patron saint of the literary elite, be drawn to the vomit-stained confession of a recovering crack addict? The answer lay in the hidden architecture of Nan's own psyche. For 40 years, she had lived with Gay Talese, a man who documented the hidden, seedy, and chaotic underbelly of American life. She had spent decades maintaining a surface of perfect control while managing the private chaos of a complex marriage. She understood the duality of the human condition better than anyone. She was drawn to Frey's book not despite its ugliness, but because of it. It felt like emotional truth, a phrase that would soon become the weapon used to destroy her. She bought the book. She edited it with her usual care, though she left the jagged edges of Frey's style intact. She believed she was nurturing a new masculine voice in American letters, a Hemingway for the rehab generation. When A Million Little Pieces was published in 2003, it was a solid success. The critics were divided. Some found it powerful, others found it repetitive, but it sold well. It seemed destined to be a cult classic, a book passed hand to hand in dorm rooms and AA meetings. Then, the lightning struck. In the autumn of 2005, 2 years after its publication, the phone rang in Nan's office. It was Harpo Productions. Oprah Winfrey, the most powerful woman in American culture, a figure with the ability to turn a book into a biblical event, had chosen A Million Little Pieces for her book club. The effect was instantaneous and nuclear. The presses at Random House roared to life, printing millions of copies. The book shot to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and stayed there. It was the golden ticket. For Nan, it was the crowning validation. She had taken a risky, difficult book and guided it to the summit of pop culture. For a few months, Nan Talese was untouchable. She was the genius who had spotted the diamond in the rough. The sales figures were astronomical. The profits from this one book essentially subsidized the rest of her imprint's literary list for years. It was the perfect marriage of art and commerce. But in the Greek tragedy of Nan's life, hubris is always followed by nemesis. The nemesis arrived on January 8, 2006, in the form of a website called The Smoking Gun. The headline was devastatingly simple: "The Man Who Conned Oprah." Investigative journalists had dug into James Frey's past. They checked police records, they checked court documents, and they found that the book, sold as a memoir, marketed as nonfiction, was riddled with fabrications. The root canal without anesthesia never happened. The violent brawl with police that resulted in a 3-month jail sentence? In reality, he had spent a few hours in a police station for a minor traffic violation. The tragic death of a high school love interest? Heavily embellished. The central pillar of the book, the claim that Frey was a criminal mastermind who had lived a life of extreme danger, was a lie. He was a suburban kid with a drug problem and a vivid imagination. The literary world exploded. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal of the sacred pact between author and reader. And standing squarely in the blast zone was Nan Talese. Her initial reaction was defensive. It was the same reflex she had honed during the Thy Neighbor's Wife scandal. Deny the premise of the attack. She released statements arguing that the essential truth of the book, the struggle against addiction, was real. She argued that memoir is a subjective genre, a painting rather than a photograph. It's not a police report, she told reporters. She was applying the logic of 1970s new journalism to the 2000s culture of literalism. She failed to read the room. The public didn't care about subjective truth. They felt scammed. They had cried over those pages. They had bought the book because they believed it was real. Oprah Winfrey initially stood by the book. She called into Larry King leave to defend Frey, saying that the message of recovery mattered more than the details. Nan breathed a sigh of relief. If Oprah was on their side, they could weather the storm. But the tide turned. The media pressure on Oprah became unbearable. She was accused of peddling lies. She was accused of being a dupe. And Oprah Winfrey does not like to look like a dupe. A week later, the producers called Nan. They invited her and James Frey to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show. The invitation was framed as a panel discussion about the changing nature of truth in literature. Nan was told there would be other columnists and experts. She thought she was going there to have a high-minded intellectual debate, the kind she excelled at. She flew to Chicago. She wore a tailored suit, her pearls, and her armor of patrician calm. She was ready to discuss the nuance of memory. She walked into an ambush. The date was January 26, 2006. It remains one of the most infamous hours in television history. When Nan walked onto the stage, she realized immediately that something was wrong. There was no panel. There were no other experts. It was just Oprah, James Frey, and Nan. The audience was silent, radiating a cold, judgmental hostility. Oprah turned to Frey first. She flayed him. With a righteous, cold fury, she dismantled his lies one by one. She forced him to admit on national television that he had made it up. Frey crumbled. He looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar, stuttering, sweating, broken. Then Oprah turned her gaze to Nan. "Nan, you are the publisher," Oprah said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Why didn't you check? Why did you present this as the truth?" For the first time in her career, Nan's legendary composure worked against her. In the context of a glitzy TV studio, her cool, intellectual detachment looked like arrogance. She tried to explain the editorial process. She tried to explain that publishers don't have private investigator divisions. She tried to pivot to the literary argument about emotional resonance. "I think the book is valid," Nan said, her voice steady but thin. "It is his truth." Oprah cut her off. "But it's not the truth." It was a collision of two tectonic plates, the old world of New York publishing, where truth was a flexible artistic concept, and the new world of reality TV, where authenticity was a currency that could not be counterfeited. Nan sat there, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, while the most beloved woman in America scolded her like a schoolgirl. It was a public shaming of biblical proportions. The audience booed. The camera zoomed in on Nan's stoic face, searching for a tear, a quiver, an apology. She did not apologize. She refused to throw her author under the bus, even as the bus was rolling over both of them. She clung to her principles, that she had bought a story, not an affidavit, even as those principles were being mocked by millions of viewers. Back in New York, Gay Talese watched the broadcast. For the first time in their 45-year marriage, the roles were reversed. He was the one watching his spouse be incinerated by the media. He was the one feeling the protective, helpless rage. He later said that watching Nan on that stage was the most painful moment of his life. He saw her dignity being used as a weapon against her. He saw the world misunderstanding the woman he knew to be the most honest person on earth. When Nan returned to New York, she was bruised. The press was merciless. Publishers Weekly, the New York Times, the blogs, they all declared that her reputation was in tatters. They called her an enabler of fraud. They questioned her judgment. They questioned her legacy. But Nan Talese did not hide. She went to the office the next morning. She sat at her desk. She picked up a manuscript. The Frey scandal became the defining narrative of her later career, overshadowing decades of literary excellence. It was a bitter pill. She had spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight only to be burned by it in the final act. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, a strange thing happened. The industry, the real industry, the writers, the agents, the other editors rallied around her. They knew the truth. They knew that every memoir is a lie to some degree. They knew that Nan had been the scapegoat for a systemic issue in publishing. They admired her refusal to crack on live television. Nan realized that she had survived the worst thing that could happen to a public figure, total humiliation. And she was still standing. She was still Nan Talese. The scandal had stripped away the veneer of perfection she had maintained since her days at the convent. But what remained was something stronger: resilience. She had faced the fire of the sexual revolution in her own marriage. She had faced the fire of the media in her career. As the noise of the scandal faded, fading into the relentless news cycle of the 21st century, Nan retreated back into the work. She found solace in the sentences. The world outside could scream about facts and lies, but on the page, she could still create order. She could still make things beautiful. But the incident left a mark. It changed her. It made her warier, harder. She realized that the culture had shifted into a place where nuance was dead, where ambiguity was a crime. She was a woman of the gray areas living in a black and white world, and as she looked at her husband, now in his 70s, struggling with his own legacy, she realized that they were the last of a dying breed. They were the dinosaurs of the printed word, watching the asteroid fall. But there was one final chapter to be written. The story of Nan Talese was not just about endurance. It was about the final reconciliation. The reconciliation between the editor and the wife, between the public image and the private soul. As the sun began to set on the Talese empire, Nan and Gay would find themselves alone together in the townhouse, surrounded by thousands of books, facing the only ending that truly matters. The James Frey scandal was more than a bad PR moment. It was a harbinger. It signaled the death of the editor's authority. In the past, if Nan Talese said a book was true, it was true because she said so. Her stamp was the verification. But in the age of Google, authority had been democratized. Any teenager with an internet connection could fact-check a memoir. The gatekeepers were being overrun. Nan understood this. She saw the writing on the wall, even if she didn't like the font. She saw that the mystique of publishing, the smoke and mirrors that allowed editors to be magicians, was gone. In the years that followed, she continued to publish brilliant books, but she did so with a kind of melancholy wisdom. She knew that the golden age was over. She was the captain of a beautiful, majestic ship that was slowly sinking, not because of a hole in the hull, but because the ocean itself was drying up. Yet, she refused to abandon the ship. She would go down with the orchestra playing. She would edit until the lights went out. Because for Nan Talese, the act of editing was not just a job. It was a way of imposing logic on a chaotic universe. It was the only way she knew how to live. The scandal receded, but its shadow remained over Nan's later years. A reminder that publishing had entered a new age where ambiguity was no longer tolerated. It was not the tense silence of a marriage in crisis, nor the focused silence of an editor at work. It was the hush of twilight. As the dust settled on their public lives, Nan and Gay found themselves drifting toward a new shore, a place beyond ambition, beyond reputation, and finally, beyond the need to perform. The war was over, the soldiers were old, and the only territory left to conquer was the quiet space between two chairs in a smaller room. Nan and Gay were now in their 80s. In any other industry, in any other city, they would have been retired playing bridge in Florida or watching the tide roll in the Hamptons. But the Taleses were creatures of Manhattan. They were fueled by the friction of the city. Retirement was a concept they did not recognize. It sounded too much like death. Nan continued to go to her office at Random House every day. The office was smaller now, the staff leaner. The publishing world had fully metamorphosed into a data-driven corporate machine where branding mattered more than prose. Nan moved through this new world like a deposed royal who still refused to abdicate. She continued to publish serious books, ignoring the trends of vampires and erotica, insisting that there was still a reader out there who cared about the human soul. But the physical landscape of their lives was changing. The legendary townhouse on East 61st Street, the 5-story fortress that had housed their marriage, their scandals, and their separate lives, was becoming too heavy to carry. For 50 years, that house had been the perfect metaphor for their relationship. Gay had the 4th floor, Nan had the 3rd. They had separate phone lines, separate studies, and famously, separate emotional climates. The house allowed them to be together while being apart. It was the architectural enabler of their longevity. In 2011, they put it on the market. Packers arrived to box up half a century of history. It was an archaeological dig of the American literary century. There were letters from Sinatra, manuscripts from Roth, notes from Capote, and in every room the ghosts of the parties they had hosted, the laughter, the smoke, the whispers about infidelity, the clinking of glasses. Leaving the townhouse was an admission of frailty. It was an acknowledgement that they could no longer sprint up 4 flights of stairs. They moved to a smaller apartment, a single floor. The vertical distance that had separated them was gone. For the first time in decades, they were living on the same plane, forced to navigate the intimacy of shared space without the buffer of staircases. And just when the world thought the Talese drama had finally quieted down, there was one last flare-up, one final controversy to remind the world that they were not dead yet. In 2016, Gay published The Voyeur's Motel. It was a strange, unsettling book about a motel owner in Colorado who had spent decades spying on his guests through ceiling vents. Gay had known the man for years. He had corresponded with him. He had known about the crimes, the invasion of privacy, the witnessing of a murder, and had said nothing, saving it for the story. The reaction was a pale echo of 1980. There was outrage, yes. There were questions about journalistic ethics. Is Gay Talese a creep? The blogs asked. Is he complicit? But this time, Nan's reaction was different. In 1980, she had been the stoic victim. In 2006, she had been the defensive gatekeeper. Now, in 2016, she was simply tired. She did not edit the Voyeur's Motel. She distanced herself from it not with anger, but with a gentle wave of the hand. When reporters asked her about the controversy, she smiled that impenetrable Ahern smile and said, "That is Gay's project." She had finally, truly, learned the lesson she had been practicing for 50 years. His sins were not her sins. She had achieved the ultimate detachment. She watched the controversy swirl around her husband with a kind of affectionate pity. He was an old lion trying to roar one last time, trying to provoke a culture that had moved on to newer, faster forms of voyeurism. In these final years, the dynamic of their marriage settled into something profound and strange. The sexual jealousy was long dead. The professional rivalry had cooled. What remained was a bond that defied categorization. They were two survivors of a shipwreck they had built themselves. They would be seen dining at their favorite Italian restaurants in Midtown, a fragile, elegant couple. He, always in his bespoke suits and fedora, she, in her pearls and sharp blazers. They didn't speak much at dinner. They didn't need to. They had said everything there was to say. Gay, the man who had spent his life chasing the thrill of the new women, new stories, new scandals, found himself in the end clinging to the one thing that had never changed, Nan. He began to speak of her in interviews with a new reverence. He called her his savior. He admitted in his roundabout way that she was the stronger one. Nan is the grown-up, he would say. I am just the noise. Even as her eyesight faded, even as her energy waned, she kept her pencil sharp. She knew that the world of books was vanishing, drowning in a sea of tweets and hot takes. She knew she was guarding a dying flame, but she refused to let it go out on her watch. She became a mentor to a new generation of women editors. She taught them the secret art of invisibility. The editor should never be seen, she told them. If the reader notices the editing, you have failed. It was the epitaph of her own life. She had spent 80 years trying not to be seen, trying to hide behind the text, behind the husband, behind the manners. But in her effort to disappear, she had become indelible. In 2020, Nan officially stepped back from her imprint. It was the end of an era. The Nan Talese logo would remain on the spines of the classics she had birthed. But the woman herself was finally putting down the pencil. Today, if you walk past a certain apartment building in New York City, you might catch a glimpse of them. They are very old now. The world outside their window is chaotic, loud, and unrecognizable. But inside there is a quiet room. Gay is sitting in a chair, perhaps reading a newspaper, perhaps dreaming of the stories he used to chase, and Nan is sitting across from him. She is not reading. She is looking at him. She is looking at the man who broke her heart 1,000 times, and the man who gave her a life of extraordinary adventure. She is weighing the pain against the glory, the silence against the noise. And if you could see inside her mind, you would see that she is still editing. She is taking the chaotic, messy, sprawling manuscript of their marriage, and she is smoothing out the edges. She is finding the theme. She is forgiving the typos. She is making it into a story that makes sense. She realizes now that she was never the victim. She was never the woman behind the man. She was the author of the entire experience. He provided the raw material, the chaos, the affairs, the scandals, but she provided the form. She decided what to keep and what to cut. She decided how the story would end. And she decided it would end not with a divorce, not with a tragedy, but with a quiet, stubborn persistence. History will remember Gay Talese as the pioneer of new journalism. The man who wrote Frank Sinatra has a cold and thy neighbor's wife. He will be remembered as the voice. But history, if it is paying attention, will remember Nan Talese as the spine. She was the woman who proved that silence is not an absence of power, but a concentration of it. She showed that you can stand in the center of a hurricane and not be blown away, provided you have deep roots. She was the editor of the American Century. She polished the prose of our greatest writers, and she polished the rough edges of her own destiny. She took a life that could have been a tragedy, a life of betrayal and public humiliation, and she edited it into a triumph of dignity. As the lights go out in the skyscrapers of New York, Nan Talese closes her eyes for the night. She does not need to read anymore. She knows the story by heart. She knows that the writer provides the words, but the editor provides the meaning. And in the final analysis, Nan Talese has provided the meaning for it all.